Now, I'd like to talk today about the reasons why an author might write a story. Now, I'd like to talk today about the reasons why an author like Bill Peet might write a story. Some stories are meant just to entertain you. For instance, if you've ever read a Captain Underpants book, you'll know that those stories are very silly. The author wrote the story so that you would laugh, and they try to make you laugh as much as possible by telling a silly story. They're not usually trying to do much more than that. In other words, they're not trying to teach you a lesson or say something about the world. They're just trying to make you laugh. Now, Bill Peet is often trying to make you laugh too, but he's usually also trying to do something else in his story. That is, he's trying to teach a lesson, or there's some kind of theme to his story. Let me give you an example. In this story, called Eli, the lion whose name is Eli, he learns that friendship can be really helpful. He meets this bird, actually a group of vulture birds, and at first he's really annoyed with them, but then he learns that by being friends with them, that they actually save his life. Now, if Bill Peet had wanted to tell us that having good friends is important and all about how important friendships are, he could have written a story like, once upon a time there was a lion who didn't have any friends, and then he made some friends and his life was saved, and friendship's really important. The end. Well, now, he got across his point if he did that, but it's not very interesting. You wouldn't really want to read a story like that. He's just telling you his opinion about something. So instead he wrote a story that kind of shows you with an example and a fun story why friendship is really important. And of course the lesson of Eli, the story, is kind of embedded quietly into the story. That is, Bill Peet in the story, he never says oh yeah, friendship's really important. He just shows a story, and then at the end he hopes that you'll understand that what he was trying to say is that friendship was really important. Or take the Wingding Dilly. At the beginning of the story, Scamp wants to be someone else. He wants to be a great horse. And then he gets turned into the Wingding Dilly, and he finds out that Orvie, his friend, actually wished that he was a dog all along, and that Orvie would rather have a dog than a horse. And of course, when Scamp was the Wingding Dilly, nothing went right for him. At the end of the story, he gets turned back into a dog and he runs home to Orvie. I wonder, what do you think is the message or the theme or the lesson that Bill Peet is trying to tell us in the story The Wingding Dilly? Let's take 30 seconds and turn and talk with a partner. What lesson do you think Scamp learned in The Wingding Dilly? Ready? Let's turn and talk. So hopefully you kind of understood that the lesson in the story is just to be yourself. If Scamp had just Scamp didn't really want to be a dog, but as it turned out, Orvie loved him as a dog, and he really didn't need to try to be like a Wingding-Dilly or a great horse like Palomar. All he had to do was be himself, and everybody liked him. So that's kind of a message in the story that Bill Peet was trying to tell us. Again, though, he didn't just come out and say, by the way, you should try to be yourself at all times, because if he had said it that way, we might not have paid as much attention. But in the story, we kind of get, but if we get really into the story and really care what happens to Scamp, we're going to like feel that lesson much more deeply. We're going to like remember it better if he tells it in that way. One more example. So in this story, Farewell to Shady Glade, some animals are pushed out by people who want to build some things. I think I told you about this earlier. And so here the message is about being respectful to animals, and for humans not always to just get what they want, but also to think about animals. But again, because we care a lot about the animals in the story when we're reading it, that message that Bill Peet wants to tell us feels much more important than if he had just kind of lectured us about that. If you haven't had a chance to read Eli or Farewell to Shady Glade, you might try reading those books during our book project time. Speaking of which, we're going to work for about a half an hour to start today's class on your book project, okay? Your teacher's going to be giving out lots of points for people working hard and remembering to make those projects look really beautiful. Then in a little while, we're going to come back and I'm going to read you a story called The Wump World, which we talked about before. It has an interesting message from Bill Peet, an interesting theme in the book, and I want to see if you can figure out what it is. Okay, but first let's work on those projects for about a half an hour, and let's begin. Okay, we're going to read The Wump World now, and this book's a little bit shorter than the other two Bill Peet. Okay, we're going to read The Wump World now. It's a little bit shorter than the other two Bill Peet books that we've read, and I want you to try, while we're reading the book, to see if you can figure out what the author's message is, because at the end of the story, I'm going to ask you to write down a little bit about what you think it is. Now, the Wump World was a small world, very much smaller than our own. So here's the Wump World. The Wump World was a small world, very much smaller than our world. There were no great oceans or lofty mountains or giant forests or broad sandy deserts. The Wump World was mostly grassy meadows and clumps of leafy greens. The Wump World was mostly grassy meadows and clumps of leafy green trees with a few winding rivers and lakes, but it was perfect for the Wumps, who were the only creatures living there. The Wumps were simple grass eaters and spent most of their time grazing on the tall, tender grass that grew in the meadows. In warm weather, they cooled themselves in the crystal clear rivers and lakes, and at night they slept in the shelter of the bumbershoot trees that kept the dew off their backs. Since the Wumps had no enemies, they wandered around just as they pleased, with nothing whatever to worry about. However, the Wumps would have worried if they had known that someone 1,000,000 miles away was watching their little world. One morning the Wumps were awakened by a far-off humming sound. It seemed to be coming from somewhere above. And as the humming grew into a heavy roar, the sleepy-eyed Wumps crept through the trees for a peek up at the sky. Zooming straight for the earth came a great flock of pot-bellied monsters, with tails and fins, spitting fire and shooting out streaks of black smoke. And by the way, and of course the Wumps call this their Earth. As the monsters swooped down to land, huge legs sprang from their bulging sides, and like gaping mouths, doors flew open, and then ramps shot to the ground. And down the ramps came a horde of tiny creatures swarming out into the meadow. These were the Pollutions from the planet Pollutus. They had left their worn-out old planet to start a new life in a new world. After such a long journey, the Pollutions were overjoyed to find themselves on solid ground once again. You can see how happy they are. They were all prattling with excitement as they followed their leader, the topmost Pollution and world chief, across the meadow. They were all prattling with excitement as they followed their leader, the topmost Pollution and world chief, across the meadow. At the top of the hill, the chief stopped for a long look at the surrounding countryside. "Finally," he said, "looks good. We'll take it. Plant the flag, Sergeant, and let's get things going." One shrill trumpet blast brought giant machines thundering out of the yawning spaceships, rolling down runways and out onto the meadow. The timid Wumps had been watching warily from the shelter of the trees, and at the sight of the great machines they were horrified. "Wump, wump!" they cried, and in a wild-eyed panic they went humpity-clumping off through the trees to go diving headlong into the nearest cave. Then down they tumbled head over heels through a twisting tunnel to end up huddled together in dark caverns, while the earth-shaking machines rumbled and roared high above. Now, once they got started, the monstrous machines moved at a furious pace, gobbling up trees and grinding them to bits. More giant machines flattened the ground, followed by great scoopers and scrapers and diggers and gigantic cranes. Soon the entire Wump world was overrun. The busy little Pollutions kept their mighty machines going full blast day and night without let-up, in a frenzy to improve their wonderful new world. I have a turn and talk question for you. So the Pollutions felt like they were trying to improve Wump World. Why do you think that they thought that they were improving the world? And do you agree that they were improving it? Let's put up 30 seconds, find a partner, and turn and talk. It's interesting. I actually have a connection here to the real world. So I used to live in a place called Palo Alto, and some people wanted to build Palo Alto. It was a small town into a place with like a lot of high, tall buildings and skyscrapers. They said it would make the city much better to have like big buildings and more people there and more like industry and commerce. While other people disagreed. They thought that it was better to like keep the town small and keep more nature and to put like a height limit so the buildings wouldn't get too tall. And they argued about that a lot. And I notice here the Wumps probably don't really like the idea of all these new buildings and roads and everything, but the Pollutions seem to think that they're improving the world. So kind of a difference of opinion there. I wonder what you thought. Let's continue though. Suddenly, great cities sprang up. Huge factory buildings with towering smokestacks, high-rise apartment buildings, and tall office buildings. And above them all loomed the 100-story skyscrapers. Along with the buildings came a tangle of streets and freeways, with on-ramps and off-ramps, overpasses and underpasses, jammed with trucks and buses of all sides rushing pell-mell in every direction. It was one great turmoil of noise and confusion, and there was still more to come. Meanwhile, the poor Wumps remained underground, wandering aimlessly through the caverns, feeding on the fuzzy green moss growing on the ledges, and the mushrooms clustered in the crannies, and sipping the sweet water from pools fed by underground springs. But they were very unhappy. For all they knew, they might have to spend the rest of their days down here. The Wumps didn't dare go up to the surface, not even for a peek. They were much too frightened by the endless rumblings and roarings and loud screechings coming from above, and it was growing noisier by the day. There were more and more noise and more of everything. More buildings with more smokestacks, puffing more and more smoke. More freeways with more traffic, shooting out more and more clouds of exhaust. More trash and more trash piles, with more and more waste gushing into the rivers and lakes. Pretty soon, the cities were so crowded by the factory smoke and the fumes from the freeways that the pollutions could barely breathe. They went sneezing and wheezing about the streets, grouching and grumbling and blaming one another for the awful mess they were in. I wonder if you can make a connection here, either to yourself or to another. Something that happened in your own life or something in the world or another text. Talk with a partner for 30 seconds and let's see if you were able to make a connection. Let's turn and talk. As you might know, many American cities have had trouble with pollution, but there's also some cities across the world, like in China, where pollution is so bad that there's certain days where people can't even go outside because the air is literally toxic, like it can hurt your lungs to breathe it. That was one connection I came up with. Now, one day an angry crowd gathered outside the World Tower building, demanding to see the world chief. When the chief appeared on his balcony, all the pollutions began shouting at once. "We can't breathe the air, we can't drink the water, and we can't stand the noise. We've had enough." "Ah, kerchoo," sneezed the chief. "I know just how you feel, and something will be done at once, I promise." With no time to lose, the chief called for a meeting with his 3 top outer spacemen. "Gentlemen," he said, "this world of ours has gone sour. We've got to get out of here quick. But first we must find a new world, a better one. That's your job, men, so get going." "Righty-o, Chief," barked the men, and within 15 minutes they were at the spaceport aboard their spaceships. Then zaroosh, 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 the men took off in 3 different directions, and in seconds they were zooming about in outer space at 7,000 miles an hour. Days passed with no word from the outer spacemen, and after waiting a week, the world chief flew into a rage. "Blast it all," he bellowed. "What's keeping those blithering bubble heads?" Then one morning, on a Monday, out of the dark smudgy sky swooshed one of the spaceships. As the ship touched down, the man hopped out shouting, "I've done it! I've done it! I've found a new world, a bigger and better world." "Nice going, lad," cried the world chief, and the crowd gathered at the spaceport gave their hero one great rousing cheer which ended in a fit of sneezing. In no time the great news was sent flashing around the world over the radio and TV, warning all pollutions to be packed and ready to go within 24 hours. At dawn the next day, the entire population swarmed into the Space Center and crowded aboard the giant spaceships. Now, after double-checking to make sure all pollutions were accounted for, the world chief gave the signal for himself. Now, after double-checking to make sure all pollutions were accounted for, the world chief gave the signal for blast-off. With a thunderous roar, the giant ships shot off the ground, kaboom, up and away through the smoke-blackened sky, and were gone. And at long last, peace and quiet settled over the Wump world. The sudden silence came as a shock to the Wumps. They could hardly believe their ears. Still, they wanted to take no chances, and so they remained in their cavern with their ears cocked for the slightest sound. After a long, long silence, they decided it was time to go, and led by the biggest Wump, they crept up the tunnel to the cave entrance to find it covered by a crust of cement. With one powerful push of his snout, the biggest Wump bumped his way through. Then, one by one, the Wumps waddled out onto a freeway and gaped in wide-eyed amazement. They had feared something awful was happening to their world, but this was much, much more than they could have imagined. They were staggered by the size of the huge buildings with walls and walls of windows looming up on every side, and the broad layers of hard, flat crust covering the earth, which felt strangely cold to their feet. There was no sign of any tree or tuft of grass. Even the sky was gone, and the Wumps wondered if there was anything left for them. At least they must find out. They wandered the freeways for miles, only to find more and more buildings with endless heaps of wreckage and rubble. For all they could see, their world was completely ruined. Footsore and weary, the Wumps were about to give up and head for their cave, when the biggest Wump let out a joyful "Wump!" Just ahead of them was a grassy meadow with a clump of bumbershoot trees, all that was left of their lovely world. Wumping for joy, the Wumps went bounding off the freeway out into the meadow. Pretty soon the hungry Wumps were munching away on the tall, tender grass. Now there was new hope for the Wumps. In time the murky skies would clear up, and the rains would wash the scum from the rivers and lakes. The tall buildings would come tumbling down, and the freeways would crumble away. And in time the green growth would wind its way up through the rubble. But the Wump world would never be quite the same. Most Bill Pete stories have happy endings, but that ending is definitely a little bit sad. I wonder if you can think a little bit about what Bill Pete's message might be. Think about how it might relate to things that you know. Think about how it might relate to people. Think about how it might relate to places you know, and see if you can make some connections to the world. So the question I want you to answer on the page that we're going to give you now is, What do you think Bill Pete's message is for us about this story? What is he trying to say? What is the theme of the story? Probably the easiest way to answer that question is, what is Bill Pete trying to say when he writes his story? What's his purpose for writing it? I'd like you to write a couple of sentences explaining what you think the message is, and then write a sentence explaining how you know. Your teacher is going to be giving points for your answers, so the more that you write and the better you can explain it, the more points your teacher is going to give you. You can take a few minutes to work on that answer. When you finish, give it to your teacher, and then you can continue working on your book gallery project once you finish that. By the way, nobody should really be finished with their book gallery project yet, I don't think, because if you've done your very best work and made it look really pretty and been really creative and tried to make it a great book project, I wouldn't think you'd be done yet. However, if at some point you do finish and it looks really great and your teacher says you're all set, then you could start on a second book project that you'd like to do for the gallery. Okay, so complete that Wump World worksheet and then you can begin.